I am Khamis Al-Ali, and I'm honored today to host Dr. Leonid Peisakhin, who's an associate professor of political science at New York University Abu Dhabi branch. And all the way abroad, Mr. Alessandro Accorsi will be also joining us, but virtually. Alessandro is a senior analyst on social media and conflict in the International Crisis Group. To make the best use of the time allocated to us, let me jump directly into the questions and ask Dr. Leonid here. Doctor, how can we differentiate between misinformation and disinformation in the times of conflict, and what are the most common tactics used to spread deceiving narratives?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, and thank you to all of you for coming to this event. As Khamis had just said, I'm an academic, so my perspective is a little bit different from a perspective of a journalist or a policymaker. And before I answer this question, the answer to this question is that it's very difficult to distinguish between misinformation, so accidental use of information to spread fake news or, information that's not true, to intentional spread of fake news, which would be disinformation. Before I talk about that specifically, let me just maybe make a couple of very brief remarks about with regards to contextualizing this problem of fake news more broadly. And I think the challenge that the media and policymakers have faced over the past 15 years and increasingly facing as time goes on is that the media environment, as all of you know, has changed so very profoundly as a result of the rise of social media. So, before, let's say, the early 2000s, we had an environment where media was dominated by big outlets that employed a very large number of journalists that cross-checked their stories. They had reporters in foreign countries, and so they were embedded, and that led to a particular type of news reporting. As you know, since the rise of social media, everyone has basically become kind of journalist. So de facto, anyone with a social media account, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, can become an unintentional sort of journalist. And that has really massively complicated the media environment. So yes, we have the big media outlets, but as we all know, people are increasingly consuming information via social media, often via unverified accounts, things from accounts that cannot be connected to major media outlets. An even bigger problem is the creation of echo chambers, where people have become isolated surrounded by individuals who have similar interests to them, where they're no longer receiving objective information, they're not receiving objective reporting, and they're interested in living in an environment where they receive slanted information. It's actually their preference often to receive biased information because it confirms their pre-existing biases, what in the academic literature and elsewhere is called a confirmation bias. So you read the news that confirms the views that you already hold, or you follow social media accounts that are consistent with your beliefs, and you're not particularly interested in consuming information from the other side, or information that can be considered to be unbiased and objective. What's even worse, in addition to the fact that we had the rise of these echo chambers as a result of the rise of social media, what's even worse is that there is commercial pressure for newspapers, for media outlets, to cater to the existence of these echo chambers. So if a news outlet, even a mainstream newspaper, knows that people are seeking out biased media, there is a commercial incentive for television channels, for news outlets, to actually provide biased news, or news with a particular editorial slant, because they know that it increases their readership and increases their consumption. And so the problem of fake news, I think, has to be understood in this context, in the broader context of the change of the media environment as a result of the rise of social media, and most importantly in the context of the rise of echo chambers. And then I guess later on we can talk a little bit about what are the solutions to these problems. But finally, to come back to your question, Khamis, sorry, I took a while to get there. With regards to the difference between misinformation and disinformation and how we tell these apart, I guess the only way to tell them apart is to figure out where does the information originate. So who is the original source of this information? And based on that, we will be able to figure out potentially we might be able to figure out what was the intent of that original source. Was the intent to spread disinformation, So to convince people in the knowledge that this information is fake, or was it an accidental spreading, sharing of biased information or fake news by an individual who is actually not guilty of creating biased content themselves? And I think the biggest danger here is not actually disinformation, because if we know that the source that originates this piece of news is biased, we can kind of guard ourselves against that. But the biggest problem here is misinformation. So the fact that fake news that is spread via multiple social media accounts where we do not know where the information actually originates is going to impact somebody who might be producing mainstream information, a journalist, let's say, writing for a major publication, or an individual who is not looking to be inside an echo chamber, who is not looking to consume biased news, but who is nevertheless exposed to that. So to my mind, misinformation is a bigger problem than disinformation. And, I guess as we go on, we can talk a little bit about possible solutions to this.
Fair enough, Doctor. Mr. Alessandro, nowadays with all that spread of the spread of social media and the influence that it has, and then keeping in mind that AI is coming also, and with all its effect on media in general, in your opinion, what can governments and NGOs do to safeguard individuals from being trapped by misinformation?
I think Dr. Leonid already said perfectly the same, and I will jump back on the point of the confirmation biases, because that's what we see as the main problem also in conflicts. The fact that misinformation, disinformation reinforces, like, when audiences are confronted with conflicting information, with a lot of misinformation, they tend to rely on their own confirmation biases. And what we see in the shift in what happens in conflict is that actors are not fighting anymore for the support of the center, but they're rather trying to reinforce these echo chambers, trying to polarize the audiences and go for the extremes. That creates a lot of challenges in terms of crisis management, in terms of conflict management and resolution, because we see that it creates two parallel realities, two parallel echo chambers that can be fed alternative events. Having said that, or alternative versions of facts. Having said that, I don't think that it's the government's role to protect truth. I think, if anything, the governments have a duty to commit to transparent information and to ensure transparency of information. One of the problems we see more and more is that governments are in a particularly advantageous position to use the whole misinformation, disinformation dynamics for their own ends, because they have the resources to be able to organize disinformation campaigns, for example. They have an influence on a lot of the information that circulates and the media sources that come with it. And they have, and oftentimes they are part of the problem, because instead of committing to transparency, to supporting a free and independent media or access to information, they tend to manipulate the information that is available to their own advantage. And in conflicts, this happens more and more often. So again, I don't think it's their role to protect truth. I think it's their role to make sure that there are some mitigation factors. One other thing that I would add is that in conflicts, the problem of misinformation, disinformation is particularly severe, because we see a trend to limit access to journalists on the ground and to limit access to information. What that means is that often media, like even traditional media, has to report based on sources that are not direct because they don't have access to the ground, but they have to rely on media offices of the government and institutions of the military. And if there's no transparency at that level, we are not going to have, at the end of the process, transparent and reliable information. And so that adds to the problem.
Back to Dr. Leonid here. Doctor, based on your specialization as a professor of political science, why do you think nation states in the upcoming decades should not neglect building strong capacity in media?
Well, I think that in many ways, the fight over the hearts and minds of the people is fought in the media environment and is therefore essential for governments. And I think that to add to what Alessandro was saying, we have a situation where we talked about the environment where everyone is becoming a journalist. We also now have a situation where social influencers, for example, de facto have taken on the role of journalists in many capacities and in many areas. And the problem with that is that social influencers are not trained as journalists. They do not have the same agenda as a person who represents a media outlet. They are not interested in presenting a balanced picture or in objectively covering the facts. Social influencers are paid producers of content. And so the problem is that if we allow new actors to come in, to enter this media environment, and these are actors who are not interested in representing the objective truth, who are not interested in cross-checking their facts or giving voice to both sides of the debate, which is what a good journalist, as we know, should be doing, then we have a situation where we live in a world where there is no longer truth. There is no such thing as objective reality, objective facts. There is truthiness, so there is some sort of semblance of fact somewhere behind the story, but there is no real representation of fact. And in that environment, any government should be interested, irrespective of regime type, whether it's a democracy or an authoritarian regime or a hybrid regime, so something that's in between. Every government should be interested in ensuring that the media environment is regulated, that there is a distinction that is made between, let's say, a social influencer or an account that generates deep fakes, and that these things are clearly labeled as such. We're now getting into the realm of solutions and regulation that governments are responsible for, and then separating that from actual journalism, from outlets that are interested in telling the objective truth, in cross-checking the facts, and in giving voice to both sides in the debate. You know, information is the basic cornerstone, it's the blood of any political regime. Without access to information, without knowing what's going on, be it in a conflict environment where it's especially important, or in regular politics, political culture cannot take root. You cannot have politics without understanding what actually goes on out there in the real world.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Alessandro, in your opinion, what role do you think tanks can play in addressing the spread of misinformation and disinformation? And how can think tanks contribute to the flow of trusted information otherwise?
It's a very good question because I work for International Crisis Group, which likes not to think itself as a think tank. We are something different. But I do think that think tanks might not be, with all due respect for whoever works for a think tank, might not be the most influential part in the equation. However, having said that, I do think that there is something that can be done. The first thing is that when it comes to social media, there is often a disconnect between the analysis of social media and media in general, what happens online, what happens in the media organizations, what happens in the information world, and the connections to real politics or conflicts. There is a gap. Those are usually two fields that sometimes, that obviously have consequences on each other, but that sometimes do not interact that much. Policy analysis does often not consider social media and the impact of social media, and social media analysis is often confined to the online world. So I think that one of the things that we're also trying to do at Crisis Group is try to understand what can we come up with in terms of innovative solutions or things that policymakers should pay attention to with very concrete steps. I'll give you an example. It's not exactly only misinformation and disinformation, but what we see, for example, happening in Gaza we use the term information warfare because it's not just a mix of misinformation and disinformation, the presence of, as Dr. Leonid was talking about, like social influencers who have an economic or political incentive to spread false information and misleading information. It's not just organized groups doing this, but there are other additional factors. There's the fact that access to information is limited. We do get a lot of content coming out of Gaza. We all get it on our phones. It's very disintermediated. We experience it in a very different way. But at the same time, long internet blackouts have been imposed on Palestinians in Gaza. 80% of the internet and communication infrastructure of Gaza has been destroyed. And this has huge impact on civilians. Not only civilians rely on information to make life or death decisions in times of conflict, but it also has a huge impact, for example, on humanitarian aid planning and distribution. Most of the humanitarian planning and distribution process in the past decade has moved to digital, and when you don't have internet or when you don't have reliable information, it's very hard for humanitarians to decide to assess the needs of the population and to distribute the aid correctly. So what happens is that although we have, and on top of that, there is also the fact that, yes, we do have a lot of Palestinian journalists on the ground, but they've been at the center of smearing campaigns that paint them as not professional or as not independent enough, while access to Western white journalists is limited on the ground. So what often happens is that we don't have that much information, the reliable information coming out, and it's having an impact on the ground. This to say that I think that think tanks need to think of solutions in this space as well. One of the things that we are exploring, for example, is what the future of Gaza will look like needs to entail, for example, the future of a structure of internet and communication infrastructure, access to the internet that is guaranteed, mitigating factors to make sure that Palestinian voices and Palestinian journalists are better represented. A different way also, for example, which is not so much something that policymakers can do, but trying to influence also the way media organizations are looking at the future of journalism, where it's harder and harder to report in a very classical way. We rely a lot on social media. And what we see in media organizations is this split. On one side, you have journalists using social media as a source, often without really verifying some of the information. On the other side, some of the best journalists that have been happening in the past couple of years comes from journalists who actually understand that social media can be a resource to do open source investigations, to do visual investigations, and build the tools to do a different kind of journalism. So this is one thing, for example, that think tanks can advocate. Let's invest more into this kind of journalism. Let's invest more in infrastructures in terms of communication. Let's think more of the impact, for example, of connectivity on conflicts.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandro. I have tons of questions, but let's open the floor for the audience to ask some questions. If you want to ask, please introduce yourself and make your question as short as possible, please.
My name is Jake. I'm a consultant at G3DIS. It's interesting listening to your presentation and talks. What I was wondering was the assault, as you put it, the government's role is to defend an information space in which it's relatively safe to have an unbiased conversation, or that you can have varying conversations. But what happens when you've got, say, an external actor that's deliberately trying to infiltrate that media space and to not necessarily spread disinformation, but just spread so much confusion and fake information into it that nobody can trust any of the information in the space?
Something that Western democracies are struggling with at the moment majorly, because one of the basic commitments in the democratic context is a commitment to the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And so if you're going to be committed to allowing free flow of information in your society without imposing any censorship or controls, these tools for the free flow of information can be abused, let's say by foreign agents who are often not necessarily interested in spreading particular fake news, but as you rightly said, are actually more interested in creating chaos. And so how do you deal with that? So, well, there are two ways to answer this question. I guess one answer is more short-term, which is to say that we need to start having regulation. There needs to be a regulation of social media platforms. We're kind of seeing a little bit of that with Telegram, with the recent events, when the founder of Telegram, who as we know is based in Dubai, who is actually an Emirati citizen as far as I understand, he has now taken greater responsibility to regulate the platform, to label information that is potentially biased, and to share information with the government. So I think there is a much greater role to play for governments in regulating and labeling, of asking social media companies to label misleading information, or information that originates in places that are suspect. This requires a completely new regulatory framework. The regulatory framework that we have today in the media world is not designed to deal with these challenges. We're just beginning to grapple with these problems. Ultimately, in the longer term, and this is the solution that I'm more interested in, is we need to have a situation where there is more education. And this is a role of government. It's government responsibility, both in democracies and authoritarian regimes, to ensure, we all know about social media diet, the good habits of consumption of information, right? So you need to seek sources, multiple sources. You need to cross-validate, cross-check information. But ultimately, I think we need to try to come back to civil discourse, the habit of civil discourse, the habit of asking the other side, the side that you disagree with, what do they think? What is their opinion? And actually trying to understand where they're coming from. We're now abstracting away from the immediate problems we're talking about on this panel and looking into the longer term. How do we save information? How do we ensure good media habits? There's a role there for education, starting all the way in school, in high school, and then going all the way up to university and beyond. So it's a very complex problem. We're just starting to grapple with it. The regulatory environment is not ready. We're only beginning to embrace it, but ultimately we're going to see much more regulation of social media platforms because of these problems.
So, Alessandro, do you have to add something?
I just wanted to say, yeah, there's no silver bullet, and the long-term answer is what Dr. Leonid was saying: media literacy training, more investments. We see some of these measures that have been taken, for example, in small countries like Finland, where the government has really invested in media literacy, starting from schools, and it has an effect, and it has a positive effect. I can tell you what doesn't work, and what doesn't work is to employ the same tactics that hostile actors might be using. We've seen this in a few cases where it backfired spectacularly, especially when it comes to democracies, because it's very weird when democracies use strategic communication / misinformation, disinformation campaigns, influence operation campaigns to achieve their goals, because they're not as good to do that as hostile actors, and it will only backfire. It will only create more polarization. It will only create more confusion among the audiences. On the regulations, I agree that we need to have stronger regulation when it comes to social media companies. The European Union, in this sense, has taken some steps with the Digital Service Act, which I think it's a pretty good model, although it has a lot of flaws and a lot of issues itself. The question on regulation, however, is do we leave that to governments who can decide what is permissible speech and what is not permissible speech? Or do we leave it more to the social media companies who have a huge impact in terms of policy? We have to grapple with the fact that tech companies are policy actors, often more influential and powerful, and with a much larger global reach than most countries in the world. However, those tech companies, they also have their own economic interests. They have their reputational interests. So we know also that they're not going to invest as much in moderation, for example, in countries that are not large markets for them. So can we think of ways in which, for example, if Meta or another company knows that there is an issue on their platform being abused to incite violence in contexts like Ethiopia or Myanmar, and I'm citing those two because we know from internal documents in Meta that that happened. If they see that this is happening and this is a problem, can we actually incentivize them or maybe even force them to invest the necessary financial and economic and resources to address this problem on their platform? Because they don't have the responsibility right now and they don't want to do it because those are small markets. And on the other hand, the problem with relying more on social media companies is that when a policy decision is very clear-cut from their point of view, they have no problem regulating it. We see this with Ukraine. Ukraine was a very clear-cut example where Russia's invasion was condemned by international law. Most Western countries sided with Ukraine, and it was very easy for social media companies to take a side and to apply their own rules. In other contexts, we see that the same rules are not applied equally because they either don't have an interest or because they don't have reputational gains, or they're not forced to it. So when it comes to regulations, I think it's a good way of going, an intermediate way. We still don't have an answer of how to do it. I don't think that it should completely rely on governments, and I don't think that it should completely rely on social media companies. The Digital Service Act is a good middle ground. There are a lot of problems, but it basically, it's governments asking social media companies to take more responsibility in deciding how they should implement their own policies.
Great answers. I think, Sufyan?
Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. I have comment and then a question on it. It's related to the misinformation, disinformation. At the beginning, we were thinking about this point as a matter of lack of information in the infrastructure in the countries in general, on the national level. And that was related to democracy, the need for the systems, etc. But do you think that when we think about regulation, about misinformation, it is a case, is that a disease for a country by itself, or it is an issue of international case? When we think about regulation, I think, take the case where the last statement said, if we take Ukraine and other conflicts, where you have different standing or points for the social media. I don't think that we need the regulation for the individuals, because the big players, they are who are, let's say, putting the rules for the mis and disinformation. My question, I think, like that, is it a tool or it is a disease? When we look at the misinformation or disinformation, is it a tool when we think about by the big players, politicians, or the owners of the platforms, or whatever, or it is a disease that we can check the virus and then we put the medicine for it? Thank you.
Sure, it's a very good question, actually. I would say in a way, it's a disease that can be used as a tool. And this problem is not new. In a way, it always existed. Technology has not made it better or worse, because I personally think that technology is agnostic. The technology is not either for good or bad. It depends how we use it. And if we look at the past 15 years, the effect that social media had, you can see that things that were present always before, since the Roman times, propaganda, misinformation, etc., rumors, call them however you want, have been amplified. Because social media can accelerate certain dynamics and can amplify them. It connects the people around the world. It accelerates dynamics. But if we look at the past 15 years, we've seen the spread of this problem, but we've seen also, if you think of the Arab Spring, if you think of a lot of the early mobilization on social media, this challenge to the way the information is produced and distributed has not always been bad. I think like in some cases we needed to actually change a little bit the power structure of how information is produced and distributed, because it was oligopolistic to, you know, like controlled by a few large media conglomerates. So it is a disease because it became a disease because it's too easy to weaponize, because this opportunity in a way that social media presented has not been met with safeguards, with the things that we should have done early on to make sure that the technology would be used mostly for good, not only for bad. And it was much easier to weaponize it and use the technology with an intent to harm, an intent to deceive, an intent to destabilize societies. But I like this idea of the disease because I don't think that it's something that is gonna go away. We don't have a silver bullet. We can make it better. We can probably change track at some point and bring it back into something that is a bit more neutral if we invest enough. But it's never gonna go away. It's something that's been always part of humanity, and that it just accelerated.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to agree with Alessandro that I think that, you know, we have natural diseases that occur naturally in nature and they're just present. And then we have weaponized diseases where sometimes, let's say, a nefarious, a hostile actor can take the disease and then turn it into a weapon. And misinformation, disinformation is very much like that. It occurs naturally as a result of the presence of social media, and in some ways has been always present in human societies. And it can also be weaponized by hostile actors. And then the question, I guess that the important question is, what is the solution? How do we deal with this? Well, so how do we deal with diseases? We inoculate, right? I mean, in the field of public health, what does an inoculation look like in the area of politics and social life? Education. You know, you inoculate by teaching students from school all the way up to the university to develop habits that are going to inoculate them against misinformation and disinformation. And with regards to international regulation, which is another dimension of your question, in principle, you're right. There needs to be international regulation. Which institutions do we have today, international institutions, that are capable of regulating social media platforms or are capable of regulating flow of information across borders? There are communications institutions at the UN, for example. They're set up to regulate technical issues. Their role is not to deal with political issues, and this is a political issue. So the international regulation, that's where we need to be heading, but it's going to be a while before we get there because we simply do not have institutions in place at the moment, in my opinion, at the international level that can effectively deal with this problem, which is an international problem.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandro, and thank you, Dr. Leonid. And we are looking forward to invite you and see you in our upcoming events. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming.